The Wild West was a peculiar part of the world. After all, we kind of hope that you should already be aware of that by now. That's because we've already discussed this subject in the past. You may remember an earlier investigation into the history of the Old West that went into greater depth on a number of peculiar and unexpected facts. And now, as you may have guessed, we're here for more. The next list will take us through another 10 strange facts and wacky stories about life on the frontier. Strange things were taking place all over the place at the same time as Americans were pressing westward to enlarge the Union, lay claim to new territories, and establish a transcontinental railroad system. You don't believe us, do you? Continue watching then, if you dare. These 10 anecdotes include some startling and implausible occurrences that occurred at one of the strangest moments in the history of the United States. The case of the traveling corpse. In 1911, Elmer McCurdy was convicted of robbing a passenger train in the state of Oklahoma. He was under the impression that the train was carrying tens of thousands of dollars for banks in the state, and that if he stole any of the money, he would walk away with a nice sum of booty. It was his misfortune that the train did not have any bank bullion. Even more unfortunate is the fact that McCurdy was only able to get away from the heist with a total of $46. And if that were not horrible enough, Oklahoma law enforcement officers put an end to his life by shooting him immediately after they located him several days later. But all of that is just the ordinary portion of this narrative. Things didn't start becoming strange until after McCurdy was murdered by law enforcement personnel who were fed up with him. The body of McCurdy was initially preserved using a conventional arsenic solution during the first step of the process. After then, it was sold to a carnival that traveled around the country. Carnies traveled with McCurdy's body and set it up as a sideshow at several fairs in order to capitalize on his notoriety as a lawbreaker. Their goal was to make a profit off of McCurdy's criminal past. McCurdy's body was purchased, resold, and purchased once more by a variety of county fair organizations that traveled throughout the Midwest for a staggering 60 years. Even places like wax museums and haunted homes participated in the market, and the deceased outlaw's body was sold to several of these attractions at one point or another. The long-dead McCurdy eventually made his way to an amusement park funhouse in Long Beach, California, after spending more than 60 years on the road and accumulating a sum of money that far beyond the sum he ever took when he was still alive. The year was 1976, and production crews for the television show The $6 Million Man had arrived at the park to shoot some sequences there. When McCurdy's body was being utilized as a prop during the filming process, a finger, or according to some sources, a whole arm, fell off during the shoot. The Los Angeles County Coroner's Office objected and demanded that the body be examined so that they could determine its origin. In point of fact, it was that of McCurdy, who had passed away in Oklahoma more than 65 years previously. At long last, reasonableness and common sense won out this time around. The body of McCurdy was kindly brought back to the region, which was no longer considered part of the Wild West, and he was finally laid to rest in the renowned Boot Hill Cemetery in Dodge City, Kansas. The Southpaw Puzzle. For a considerable amount of time, historians and Wild West amateur lovers alike believed that Billy the Kid was a lefty. This is due to a single photograph that has gained widespread notoriety, a tintype taken of the outlaw when he was younger, in which he can be seen wearing a gun belt on his left side and holding a Winchester Model 1873 lever-action rifle nearby. It is reasonable to conclude that Billy the Kid, whose actual name was William Bonney, was a left-handed shooter due to the observation that he wore his gun belt on his left side and held the barrel of the rifle in his right hand. This would have left his left hand free to presumably pull the trigger, which, despite the fact that it is not the most significant aspect of his contentious existence, would at least be fascinating, right? Both back then and now, there aren't nearly as many people who write with their left hand. In point of fact, however, the truth is most likely rather different from that. Tintype images, like the one you showed, were created by first creating a negative image, which was then developed in the other direction so that it seemed positive. As a consequence, the final produced photograph had a horizontal rotation of 180 degrees from what was captured. As a consequence of this, Billy the Kid's pistol belt would probably certainly be worn on his right side rather than his left side. Additionally, the gun he is holding would almost definitely be configured so that the trigger could be pulled with the right hand rather than the left hand. Additionally, there is even more. The loading gate for that particular kind of Winchester rifle is located on the right side of the weapon. According to the appearance of the photograph, it appears to be on the left, but the fact that the tintype was flipped would lead one to believe that this is not the case. In point of fact, Winchester only produced loading gates that faced to the right for the lever-action rifle model 1873. Because of this, persons who are dominant with their right hand would have had an easier time using them. Now, is it feasible that Billy the Kid was actually left-handed, but had to adjust to right-hand-focused weaponry because of the culture of the Old West? Without a doubt. But the picture that most people use as proof that he is left-handed isn't as conclusive as you might have thought it was when you first saw it. You are no longer in the dark. Gold Rush reruns. It is quite easy to fall into the trap of believing that the gold rush was literally invented by the frontier. After all, the California Gold Rush of 1848-1849 is one of the events associated with the Old West that is referenced the most frequently. When James Marshall struck it rich at Sutter's Mill in Northern California, it appeared as if the entire world flocked out west to stake their claim to their own fortunes in that land. Sutter's Mill was located in Northern California. The legend was further enriched by subsequent gold rushes in the western United States. During the second part of the 19th century, the state of Colorado had a significant gold rush, and the fabled Comstock Lode in Nevada was a silver strike that was unlike almost any other the world had seen before. However, all of that was preceded by far earlier gold rushes in the eastern regions, which were equally popular in their own heydays. In the year 1799, Cabarrus County, North Carolina, was the site of the first significant gold rush to occur in the United States. A young kid called Conrad Reed discovered a huge golden rock on the land that his father owned to the north of where Charlotte is located today. The family used it as a doorstop for many years before a traveling jeweler finally realized what it actually was: a chunk of gold weighing 17 pounds, 7.7 kilograms. The race to the finish began from that point on. Others came to the area in search of their own fortunes at the same time as the Reed family and their friends dug up all the land in the region that they could manage to dig up. Then, 20 years later, another significant gold rush took place in northern Georgia, which was only a few hundred miles away from the land owned by the Reed family. Even this drew people from far away who were looking for their riches. As they dug for whatever important metals they could find, they fought with Native American tribes and with one another, all the while seeking to gain the upper hand. All of this is to argue that the frontier was not even close to being the first place in the United States to experience the excitement of the gold rush. Even though they are the most well-known, California's 49 ERs, as they came to be known, weren't the first settlers in the area by any stretch of the imagination. Quite the contrary. The shockingly brief gunfight. You won't be able to have a complete understanding of the Wild West until you've heard the story of the gunfight at the OK Corral. First and foremost, just the name is easy to recall, and the narrative of those who battled on that terrible day in Arizona in 1881 has remained in the imaginations of members of the general public throughout the years. On one side, you had the Earp brothers, Morgan, Virgil, and Wyatt, and Doc Holliday was on the other side. Outlaws and scofflaws such as Billy Claiborne, Billy Clanton, Billy Clanton's brother Ike Clanton, and the two McClory brothers, Frank and Tom, were engaged in combat against those lawmen. After the smoke cleared, it was determined that Billy Clanton, along with the two McClory boys, had been murdered. On the side of the good men, Virgil and Morgan Earp had both been injured but managed to survive the battle. But here's the catch. There wasn't much time between when the first shot was fired and when the dust finally fell after all that had been said and done. In point of fact, 30 seconds. Even though there were 9 individuals involved and a spray of gunfire, the entire shootout only lasted for less than a minute and a half. The movies may give the impression that gunfights in the Old West were slow, drawn-out affairs in which men hunkered down behind wooden barrels and hid behind walls. But this particular gun battle was not like that at all. The most famous conflict in Western history started and finished in the same instant as it takes to blink your eye. Oh, and here's the other bizarre detail. The shootout didn't take place at the OK Corral, after all. If we're going to get technical about this, which of course we are, the shooting happened at what is now the intersection of 3rd Street and Fremont Street in the city of Tombstone. Fremont Street is named after the man who was shot there. That location is actually outside on the public road that is located behind the corral and is not included within its area in any way. Therefore, even the name we give to the event, the shootout, may not be entirely accurate. The real-life TV saloon. Have you ever watched the classic Western television show Gunsmoke? If you did, then you most definitely are familiar with Miss Kitty's Long Branch Saloon. The bar was an essential component of the legendary and still remembered television show about life on the frontier. The show was said to take place in the lawless town of Dodge City, Kansas. What if, however, we were to tell you that the saloon was in fact a real place? In point of fact, it is still operational, in a roundabout way. The real-life saloon, known as Miss Kitty's Long Branch Saloon, was a place in Dodge City where residents of the town as well as visitors traveling through might stop in for a drink, or two, or three, or four. Because it has been there for such a long time in the community, nobody really knows for certain when it was first founded. However, they are certain about the fact that the first bar was destroyed in the notorious Front Street fire that occurred in the Kansas frontier town in the year 1885. This fire destroyed a large number of local businesses in the expanding metropolis, compelling some of them to close their doors for good while compelling others to start over on top of the ashes. The saloon was reopened after a number of years had passed. It was never exactly the same as it had been back when Dodge City was still known for its notorious outlaws. And even in this day and age, it is still a possibility. Its current function, however, has little to do with the bar that existed in the 19th century, and more to do with the fact that it is a site where fans of the television show Gunsmoke may go and relive some memories from their adolescence spent watching television. Nevertheless, historians from Kansas and the museums in the surrounding area claim that the first Miss Kitty's was a rowdy hangout during its heyday. Milk, tea, and lemonade were reportedly on the menu, which, if true, is a pleasant surprise. In addition to that, it provided sarsaparilla, beer, and various other types of alcoholic beverages. Now we can actually have a conversation. If you ever find yourself in the southwestern part of the state of Kansas, you now know where to go to get a taste of the Old West. The Old West. There is no question that Native American settlements in America existed many thousands and thousands of years before European ones did. There is no room for doubt in that regard. Alternatively, there really shouldn't be any at all, because although Jamestown was the first settlement of European immigration to North America, when more over 100 inhabitants showed up in 167, it was not the first permanent settlement in what is now the United States of America. In point of fact, this is not the case by any means. Historians have determined that the Acoma Pueblo, which is located just to the west of what is now Albuquerque, New Mexico, was inhabited at least 500 years before the Jamestown settlement. Acoma Pueblo wasn't discovered by Europeans until much, much later, when Spanish conquistadors and missionaries passed through the area. Until then, nobody in Europe knew about it. But despite the fact that white settlers never knew where to look for it, it was still present in the territory. When things were really going well, the Acoma Pueblo was quite the operation as well. It was referred to by the Acoma as their Sky City community. Approximately 5,000 people were living there permanently at the time. In addition to this, it was situated on the highest point of a mesa that measured 300 feet, 91.4 meters in height, which gave it a natural defense advantage. Because of this advantage, the Acoma Pueblo was able to develop into a cultural hub. Native communities from hundreds of miles away would travel great distances to engage in commerce and cultural exchange with the Acoma people. The location is still home to a cultural center and a historic heritage complex in the modern day. The area gives people in the United States the opportunity to study everything there is to know about the very first civilization to dwell inside its present-day borders. To be more precise, its history extends back much further than anything that took place in the Old West or anywhere else in the United States. The first phony film cowboy. Bronco Billy Anderson is a name that, if you have any knowledge at all about the history of classic Western films, you have undoubtedly come across at some point. He played the role of a cowboy in the silent film The Great Train Robbery, which was released in 1903. However, the reality of Anderson's real life away from the film was quite different from what one might expect of America's first cowboy celebrity of the moving picture age. Anderson was a very private person in real life. In point of fact, Anderson was a local of Arkansas named Maxwell Henry Aronson, who was born in 1880. It turned out that he was the son of a traveling salesman who had made his living by going all over the Ozarks in order to sell items to the residents of the area and to the proprietors of dry goods stores. Maxwell, on the other hand, did not want that for himself. Therefore, while he was only a teenager, he ran away from home and went to New York City. After relocating there, he quickly became involved in the burgeoning cinema business and began creating silent films. Over the course of his career, he ended up acting in and producing literally hundreds of different films. In this sense, he was one of the very first cinematic stars in the United States. However, he wasn't a cowboy at all. He had no experience with any region of the Wild West, as he had never worked as a cowboy, had never spent a significant amount of time in the West, and had no prior connections to the region. He was only cast in the role of the fictional Bronco Billy Anderson in the groundbreaking film from 1903, but from that point on, the legend took on a life of its own. Some of us who are more cynical could claim that he was the first in a long series of fake Hollywood stars with fabricated histories that were designed to sell to an audience that was hungry for movies. Regardless, Aronson wasn't even close to being the last one. The double-barreled Jesse James. No, we are not referring about the double-barreled Jesse James, although it is true that he was also known as such during the chaotic early years of his life. Instead, this is connected to events that took place after he passed away. After James's early days of notoriety, during which he caused mayhem and robbed banks all over the West, he eventually settled down at his homestead in Kearney, Missouri. There was only one catch to that, and that was that every adversary he created during his formative years was a violent man with an extremely long memory. Therefore, after attempting to keep a low profile for a while, he was eventually exposed by an old adversary and killed in the year 1882. At first, the body of James was laid to rest in the front yard of the farm plot that he owned in Kearney. Because of his legendary status, his family felt it necessary to take these precautions because they were concerned that trophy hunters would plunder his grave. That did not occur, and James's body was allowed to remain there for some time. After some time had passed, his remains was excavated and reinterred in a more permanent site at Mount Olivet Cemetery in the little town in Missouri. Unbelievably, though, this is not where the story comes to a close. A man came forward years and years and years after the West was won, in 1948 to be exact, claiming that he was the real Jesse James. This man's story was met with widespread skepticism. Even more remarkably, a judge granted him permission to legitimately take on the outlaw's name. In point of fact, the individual was a 101-year-old man by the name of J. Frank Dalton. The Jesse James story was completely fabricated. However, when Dalton passed away and was laid to rest in Granbury, Texas, all of it was of little consequence. The citizens of Granbury, Texas were so moved by Dalton's life and legacy that they created a tourist attraction in his honor after he passed away and was buried there. The debate around James's alleged second burial places became so heated that decades later, DNA was brought into the discussion. Kearney's James was exhumed by scientists who used mitochondrial material to prove that he was the genuine James. As a result, Dalton's assertions were proven to be false. Granbury is still known by many people as the burial location of Jesse James, even though it is not, because the myth had survived long enough to eclipse reality. This is because the story had lived long enough to eclipse fact. Cowboy hats weren't cowboy hats. Pioneers were forced to wear hats most of the time because they worked outside in the hot sun, but they didn't wear the 10-gallon hats that make us think of the Old West. Those hats didn't become popular until after the 1920s, and they only became really famous because of how cowboys were portrayed in movies. In the 1800s, real cowboys in the western half of the United States would not have worn the famous big cowboy hats. In that time, real cowboys wore a smaller Stetson hat with a flat top, which was known as the Boss of the Plains. In that time, menswear designer John Stetson saw what pioneers were wearing and came up with these real cowboy hats. In the beginning, people wore hats made of straw, silk, fur, and even wool. It didn't matter what the weather was like. They were awful in both hot and cold weather. Even worse, they got wet in the rain and stayed wet for hours afterward. This is how Stetson made the above-mentioned Boss of the Plains. It was thick and had a flat, thin top. The whole hat was made of nutria fur and was waterproof all the way through. The brim was bent at the ends to make it easy to drain water. Also, the hat could be turned over and used as a makeshift water bucket for a horse that needed it. This was an important skill for many cowboys who were crossing rough trails. If you want to know how much it cost, Stetson's new design was around $5 in most dry goods shops at the time. That's more than $1.75 today, so men who might not make a lot of money for a year of hard, punishing work didn't buy it for peanuts. The cowboys were ready to pay a lot of money to get out of the sun and rain because the product was well made and last a long time. The West had real gun control. It's simple to imagine that guns were everywhere in the Wild West. After all the great and crazy stories from that time are about criminals carrying guns and pointing them. There were shootouts, bandits, highway thefts, and daring train runs in the West. And guns were the main thing, right? Lead was stronger than both swords and pens, if we're being honest. But the West really had gun laws that were so strict you wouldn't believe it. It was a lot stricter than what we know now in some ways. There was a time when you had to give up your guns when you visited frontier towns like Abilene, Garden City, Tombstone, Deadwood, and Dodge City. In a word, at that time, most of those places had rules that said guests had to give up their guns at the sheriff's office as soon as they arrived. Then, the sheriff would give them a token that looked like the guns they were giving up, for now. In this way, the Wild West had the first coat check in the world, but it was for guns. Now, there was one group of people who weren't subject to some of those strict gun laws: locals. People who lived in a town and knew the sheriff usually had the right to keep their guns at home. A lot of bad behavior and open banditry over the years made sheriffs want unknown visitors to be unarmed as they walked through town. People who are known to be dangerous could stay armed for personal use and family safety, but in general, gun laws on the border were stricter than you might think. We hope you liked this video, subscribe to the channel if you're a history addict, and please let us know about what civilization or time period we should talk about. Also, watch another video here.